The Gilded Age is called that for a reason.
It's not known as the Golden Age, it's gilded.
A piece of junk covered in a fine layer of gold so that it looks nice and shiny to people not looking very closely. But that's not us. We're going to look a lot more closely. So last episode, I spent most of our time on the rich dudes, but just because some dudes were getting rich didn't mean that everyone was living the high life. Like I already mentioned with Carnegie, many of these men got rich on the backs of workers who were barely able to get by. And at the time, there didn't seem to be a lot of debate, at least among the elite and the power brokers, as to whether or not that was fair. It was just the way things were. And Carnegie's gospel of wealth was quite generous toward poor workers relative to the prevailing philosophy of the day, social Darwinism. For most elites, the poor were poor because they were weak or not as intelligent. The elites were elite because they were the fittest and were meant to survive and be in charge. It's garbage, but this problematic view of the economy often also melded with white supremacy to justify things like imperialism and the economic dominance of white nations over non-white parts of the world, but more on that in a few episodes. And keep in mind that workers' rights wasn't really a thing that existed up until around this era. Before the Civil War, the vast majority of Americans were self-employed as farmers or craftsmen, so the Gilded Age is kind of the first time in American history when a lot of Americans are working for someone else, and maybe someone completely unconnected to their family or community. It was kind of uncharted territory. And the laissez-faire capitalist view at the time was that, hey, if you didn't like where you were working, then leave. The problem is that there weren't many better options. Not everyone could move to Toledo and work for Samuel Golden Rule Jones. It became increasingly clear, too, that wealthy business owners had sway over the government. Hell, some of them were the government. Hey, Governor Stanford. In order to compete with the money and influence of their bosses, some workers began to form labor unions, taking the strength in numbers approach to advocate for their cause. And their causes were all slightly different. Some groups just wanted increased wages and better working conditions, but other union members are going to go further, advocating a socialist system or even a Marxist-style overthrow of capitalism. More on those ideas in a second. Unions began using strategies like strikes and boycotts to push their demands, although they were rarely very successful. Typically, the government stepped in on the side of business, like when the National Guard was called in to end the Homestead strike at Carnegie's plant. And there were no protections for workers who were fired because of union activity. In fact, some employers would go a step further and create blacklists to prevent active union members from becoming employed at any company across their industry. Bosses were also able to bring in replacement workers or scabs, often from the groups that were banned from joining unions in the first place, in some cases African Americans. Black men were beginning to move from the South in search of factory jobs, and bosses often hired them as a cheap way to replace union men. And of course, this only exacerbated growing racial tensions in northern cities and was an easy way to divide and conquer what could have been a unified labor movement based on class. But over time, the labor movement did gain footing. Various labor unions were founded during this time period, but the most prominent was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. Still in existence today as the AFL-CIO, it was founded and led for 40 years by Samuel Gompers. Gompers, great last name, by the way, and that's coming from a Glankler. He was a Jewish cigar maker who moved to New York as a young boy from London. The AFL promoted a thing called trade unionism, meaning that they believed unions should be local and made up of wage earners all working in the same trade, like his original cigar makers union that he was a part of. It functioned in some ways similar to like medieval guilds, but on a much bigger and more modern scale. This was different and a more moderate approach as opposed to other organizations at the time. The Knights of Labor, for example, wanted larger community-based organizations that included people from all across the economy, including even employers if they chose to join. Even broader than that, the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, pushed for one global organization uniting all laborers. Even though they disagreed on structure and how broad the movement should be, they were mostly in agreement on the basic goals of the labor movement: better working conditions and a living wage. Unions across the country organized a general strike in support of an 8-hour workday. It occurred on May 1st, 1886, which would become an international labor holiday. And over 200,000 workers took part in the strike across the country. Throughout the entire week, protests and strikes in multiple cities brought attention to the labor movement, but unfortunately, many of these events ended in violence, most notably in Chicago's Haymarket Square. A German anarchist named August Spies. Oh my God, it's such a great name for a German anarchist that's going to be vilified by big business. August spies, it writes itself. Anyway, he was giving a speech to May Day strikers in Chicago when he witnessed police firing on workers in the crowd. He quickly put out a flyer denouncing the event and called "Working Men to Arms" in a protest the next day at Haymarket Square. Over 2,000 people showed up, including the mayor of Chicago, to ensure the protest remained peaceful. Toward the end of the rally, police arrived to disperse the crowd, and someone from the crowd threw a bomb towards the police, who then opened fire. 7 police officers and 1 civilian died. Now, we never found out who threw the bomb, but the damage was done, both figuratively and literally. This had been the labor movement's big moment, but what most Americans saw the next day were reports of bombs and anarchists. Never mind the fact that it's unclear whether the person who threw the bomb was actually part of the labor movement, or the irony that the protests had been planned in response to police killing striking workers the day before. And one of the reasons why it was so easy for most Americans to view the labor movement with suspicion was because the labor movement was also largely a product of immigration. And Americans don't have the best track record with being super cool about immigrants coming in and shaking up our economy. So I actually did an entire podcast episode a while back about immigration and nativism in the United States. If you want a deep dive, just go check it out. But basically, immigration had been increasing throughout the 19th century, but it skyrocketed after the Civil War. For example, 12 million immigrants came to the US between 1870 and 1900, which is really the main era of the Gilded Age. But a change was also occurring. For most of American history, immigrants were mostly from Germany, Ireland, and England, and they were known as old immigrants. But now, thanks to steamships and some chaos in other parts of the world, during the Gilded Age, there was a shift to new immigrants from Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, Asia, the Middle East. Cities on the East Coast were now seeing waves of immigrants from Italy, Russia, and Syria. Fun fact, in the 1880s, just 10 years, 9% of the total population of Norway emigrated to America. Can someone tell me what the heck was going on in Norway? Anyway, from 1800 to 1880, New York City's population doubled every single year for 80 years. And as immigration rose, so did American fear of immigrants. Because you see, these new immigrants were from less desirable, air quotes very important, part of the world, meaning they weren't white. Italians, for example, would not be considered white for a long time. They were so mistreated, often subject to Jim Crow laws in the South and discriminated against in the North, that President Benjamin Harrison gave in and made Columbus Day a national holiday, honoring a historic Italian. Italians were like, I mean, it would have been cool to pass some legislation that would make Italians not so mistreated, but like Columbus Day is cool too, I guess. Again, I did a whole video on that story too. But nativism, or hatred or fear of immigrants, had been around for as long as the United States. The hilariously named Know Nothing, or Native American Party, which was not made up of indigenous Americans, but white people who were afraid of new immigrants coming to the country. This party held 6 governorships and some state legislatures before the Civil War. But the real nativist stuff hit the fan in the 1880s after a few decades of Chinese immigration to the West Coast. Remember from season 1 of my podcast, late 19th century China was struggling. They had been forced open by the British, who got them kind of addicted to opium and then fought and lost a series of wars. The Taiping Rebellion had just occurred, the bloodiest civil war in all of human history, and the country was divided over support for the emperor and a desire to overthrow their mandate. As Chinese laborers streamed into the United States, many white Americans freaked out. And let's back up for a second, because Chinese people were encouraged to come to the West Coast in the middle of the 19th century because they were cheap workers who could build the railroads. Most notably, they built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, opposite their Irish immigrant counterparts working on the eastern half. But once the railroad was complete, white Americans looked around on the West Coast and thought, why aren't they going home? Ignoring the fact that a lot of them at that point had been born in the United States. Now, the optimistic explanation of why they freaked out was that the US was going through an economic downturn in the 1880s, so they were just unhappy in general about the influx of any immigrant who might take a job away from them. But let's be real, there was a clear racial element to this as well. Many saw the Chinese as an inferior race that sat around and smoked opium all day. First, that's wrong. But second, the few Chinese people who did maybe sit around and smoke opium all day got it from the British, like we learned it from watching you. In 1882, Congress passed its first federal immigration legislation ever, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Well, at least they were upfront about it, I guess. That same year, they also passed the Immigration Act of 1882, which set up for the very first time a formal process for entering the United States. Before that point, you just show up and you're there. So now when immigrants arrived at ports of entry, they were taxed and then inspected. Immigration officials were empowered with the authority to refuse entry to anyone who is found to be, quote, a convict, lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge. It's like the Statue of Liberty, opened just 4 years after this law was passed, says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, but not your idiots. So what did these non-idiot immigrants find when they finally arrived in American cities? Well, have you ever read a Charles Dickens novel or seen child Christian Bale dancing in Newsies or watched my last episode? Then you know what Gilded Age cities were like. Sure, you had some cool novelties, the telephone, baseball, electricity, Carnegie Hall, magazines, but that was mostly for the middle and upper classes who, thanks to electric streetcars, could also afford to live in early suburbs outside the dense and polluted city center. To be clear, 19th century suburbs are like totally part of downtown in cities today. Like the Upper West Side was considered a quaint rural suburb in 19th century Manhattan. Meanwhile, the poor lived in crowded tenements that were built fast without much concern for safety. Houses that had been for single families were divided to pack as many people in as possible. There was often no plumbing or ventilation, and fires spread quickly. It was really bad. Photographer Jacob Riis blew people's minds when he published his book, How the Other Half Lives, full of photos of children sleeping on the street and families of 10 packed into one room. Middle and upper class readers were horrified. Well, some of them were. But the book did catch the attention of one of Riis's friends, who used his position as New York Police Commissioner to work to improve living conditions in poor immigrant neighborhoods. And this friend was named, drumroll, Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah, we're in Teddy times. Ugh, I can't wait to rant to you about TR in a few episodes. And if people complained about life in the cities, there was a simple solution. Just listen to the village people and go west. We'll talk more about the West in an episode or two, but for now, just know that as industry was growing back east, railroads pushed further west, bringing back materials to the factories. Keep in mind, too, that we have the Jim Crow South providing kind of the cotton and agricultural products to fuel this. And for many who were not achieving the American dream in New York or Chicago, the West and the freedom of the frontier was a really enticing option. Again, just ask Christian Bale from Newsies. But you also know this because you've seen American Tail, right? In this way, the frontier had always provided an escape for people who were unhappy or unwanted on the East Coast. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner explained the importance of the frontier in 1893 when he described it as a safety valve that could let off steam when things were getting tense in the cities. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that the labor movement grew more and more emboldened, and relations between the working class and elites escalated right at the time that the US Census announced that there wasn't a frontier left in the United States. By 1890, we had manifested our destiny across the continent. And while there was still plenty of land and opportunity, the Wild West era was over, and people in the cities stewing about low wages and mistreatment were stuck there. Sure, that's going to end well. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.